Well, thank you very much, Adrian and Matt, and everyone at Sustainable San Mateo County. Great to be here. Great to see such a wonderful audience. Thank you all for coming out. I have 12 minutes. This is going to be a little bit like speed dating, so I'm going to move kind of quickly. But I'll be around afterwards if people have questions. So our water, a little bit more than 90% comes from the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. And of that, 85% is from the Tuolumne River. 10% is from, you see Calaveras Reservoir over kind of on the right or middle there. That's Alameda Creek water. And then about 5% comes from Crystal Springs. So a lot of people think, oh, that's a major source of our water. It's important, but especially important because it's a place to store water from the Sierra during the summer months. But 85% comes from the Tuolumne River. So here's the Tuolumne. It starts high in Yosemite National Park. You can see the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, our reservoir where we store the Tuolumne water, is in the park there. And then it flows down. There's another major dam and reservoir, Don Pedro, which is owned and operated by the Modesto and Turlock irrigation districts. And that water is primarily for agriculture, about 200,000 acres in the Central Valley. It's a very big reservoir. It's the one you cross over on 120 if you're going to Yosemite. And then it passes through Modesto, joins with the San Joaquin, heads north into the Delta and Bay, and some of that water even makes it out to the Pacific Ocean. This is the headwaters. This is the Mount Lyell Glacier, 13,000 feet above sea level. This is where it all begins, and downstream is the Lyell Fork of the Tuolumne. It joins with the Dana Fork just above Tuolumne Meadows. Most people who are familiar with the Tuolumne are familiar with this area of the Tuolumne Meadows, very beautiful. And then it flows through the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne, a wonderful 3-day backpack trip if anyone's interested. And what you see, what you really notice in this photo is all the granite. That's what makes Yosemite so special. It doesn't erode very quickly, wonderful waterfalls, scenic views. But because there's not a lot of erosion, there's not a lot of sediment entering our water supply. So it's really, I say, the best water supply in the world. You don't have to filter the water. We do treat it with chloramine when it gets to the Bay Area, but we're really fortunate to have such great water. And here is the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. The dam is called O'Shaughnessy Dam, and it is named after Michael O'Shaughnessy, who worked in public works for San Francisco back at the last turn of the century. And San Francisco originally was dependent just on local water, creeks and groundwater. After the gold rush, more people were moving, they needed another supply. That's when the Crystal Springs system was created, but things kept growing, so they started looking to the Sierra for a much bigger water source. And Michael O'Shaughnessy identified Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite as a good source. A nice big canyon that narrows, and it looked like it would be ideal for a dam and reservoir. But there was a lot of opposition led by John Muir and the Sierra Club. The idea of putting a major dam in a national park didn't quite go along with the idea of national parks, that this is a place to get away from civilization, for wildlife to thrive. And Congress agreed and denied San Francisco the opportunity to build Hetch Hetchy. But then we had the 1906 earthquake and fire, and half the city burned down. Congress was much more sympathetic, realizing that San Francisco might need a reliable water supply. And in 1913, Congress approved the Raker Act, which gave San Francisco the right to build and own and operate Hetch Hetchy and O'Shaughnessy. And so the Hetch Hetchy Valley is now the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. There's a group called Restore Hetch Hetchy that last week filed suit. They've been trying to remove the dam for many years. Our organization, Tuolumne River Trust, we don't have a position on that. So downstream of Hetch Hetchy, we still have a healthy population of rainbow trout. These are really special fish. They're always born in freshwater, and they can live their life, and they can spawn and reproduce in the freshwater. But if they have an opportunity to get out to the ocean, they can make that trek. Sometimes it's hundreds of miles, and they become a saltwater fish called a steelhead. And there's a lot more food out in the ocean. They get bigger. They have a better chance of surviving and reproducing. So that's what triggers that. When it's time for them to spawn, they have to come back to freshwater. And they come back to the same river, if they can, where they were born. They can actually smell the water. A lot of times they'll spawn in the same area where they were born themselves. So these, the rainbow trout downstream of Hetch Hetchy cannot become steelhead because of the Don Pedro Dam. This stretch is also class 4 whitewater rafting. It's world class. It's some of the best in the country. We usually do 2-day trips. You don't see roads. You occasionally see an airplane going overhead, but it's just a real wilderness experience. We camp out on the beaches of the Tuolumne. We visit little side creeks and swimming holes. There's waterfalls and great fly fishing for those who are interested. So for all these reasons, in 1984, the upper 83 miles of the Tuolumne was designated a wild and scenic river by Congress and signed into law by our great environmental president, Ronald Reagan. And it's interesting that all the wonderful legislation of the early 70s, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act was signed into law by President Nixon. So things used to be a little bit more bipartisan. So here's the watershed, and you can see Don Pedro, a big reservoir in the middle. So that distinguishes the upper Tuolumne, everything upstream of that, from the lower Tuolumne. So upstream is the wild and scenic area. That means no new dams, no development along the banks. And I'll just point out that the rim fire that we're all familiar with, 97% of that burned in the Tuolumne River watershed. So that's an issue that we've been getting very involved with in policy issues as well as in restoration. And 400 acres, an area 8 times the size of San Francisco, was burned. Fortunately for us and our water supply, almost all of that was downstream of Hetchetchee, so it had very, very minimal impact on our water supply. So this is the Don Pedro Dam. It's almost 600 feet tall, so you can see how a steelhead couldn't get back and forth across that. It's interesting that San Francisco has a tie-in with Don Pedro, in that San Francisco paid for almost half of it in order to get something called a water bank there. So the way it works is the dotted purple line there is the allocation towards Modesto and Turlock irrigation districts, because they're the senior water rights holders. They were the first in the state in 1987 to get water rights. So as a relative latecomer in 1913, San Francisco had to settle for being second in line. So the idea is that depending on the time of year, there was a spike there where in the springtime when there's a lot of snow runoff, but that the irrigation districts would get the first 2,500 cubic feet per second, or up to about 4,000. And if there's excess water, that's what San Francisco can trap and store behind O'Shaughnessy Dam. If there's a lot more water, like in 2011, our last big water year, you can see there's so much water that the relatively small Hetchetchee filled up very quickly. And then the water bank allows San Francisco to store extra water that otherwise they would be entitled to in Don Pedro, and then borrow off of it later. So last year, when there wasn't much water flowing in, San Francisco captured water, and then they subtracted an equal amount from the water bank. So it's a really creative system, and it's worked really well last year. So this is another dam, LaGrange, which is 2 miles downstream of Don Pedro. And it was interesting because the Don Pedro Dam is going through Federal Energy Regulatory Commission relicensing, FERC relicensing. And that happens every 50 years as a chance to look at how conditions are on the river. And environmental groups were saying you should look at fish passage into the upper Tuolumne with all that habitat where the salmon and steelhead naturally spawn. And the irrigation district said, no, Don Pedro doesn't block fish passage. Our other dam, LaGrange, downstream blocks them, and it doesn't require a license. Well, we made a case that it should require a license, and now it does, and they're working on that, and they've agreed to study fish passage. So it could be that for the first time in over 100 years that salmon and steelhead could make it up into the upper Tuolumne. So these are Chinook salmon. They're still downstream of LaGrange. They are anadromous, which means that they're born in fresh water, go out to the ocean, but they have to make that journey to the ocean to mature and come back. So that's why they're only downstream of Don Pedro. And they're also called king salmon, because they're the largest salmon. So the salmon life cycle, born in fresh water, move out to the ocean, live there for a few years. This one was probably there for 6 or 7 years, weighed 108 pounds. They normally don't get this big. And then they stop eating and they come back to spawn. The female will lay about 5,000 eggs. The male will fertilize them and then they'll die and they'll feed the food chain. And they've also played an important role in bringing nutrients from the ocean into upland habitat and fertilizing forests and meadows. So of the 5,000 eggs, only about 2 will survive and become reproducing adults. So it's basically replacement value. And that means a lot of this energy is going into the food web, both eggs, juvenile salmon, and adult salmon. And obviously, we have learned to appreciate adult salmon. This is the lower Tuolumne, just below LaGrange, and it's the area where the salmon spawn. We have an event every year called Paddle to the Sea, where we take people on this journey. There's trips all the way from this area to the Golden Gate Bridge. And it starts in mid-May, it goes through mid-June. Most people join for a day. We have a few people who do the whole trip. If you're interested, I've left a few brochures on the back table. So the challenge is that 60% of the Tuolumne is diverted. About 80% of the water used is for agriculture and about 20% for the urban Bay Area. And more water is evaporated or percolates down into groundwater, which is being overtapped. So there's been a real problem for the fish, and only 16% of the flow is guaranteed for fish. Here's a graph that shows right after the last big drought what the natural hydrograph looked like versus what the fish actually saw on the green there. I'm moving really fast now because I have 2 minutes. Okay, low rivers have taken their toll. Before there were any dams, there were an estimated 130,000 salmon in the river. Last year there were less than 1,000, so less than 1% of the population. A lot of people in the Bay Area depend on the Tuolumne, 0.6 million. In about 2000, it was realized that the Hedveki line crosses several major earthquake faults. If one went off, it could cut off our water for 30 to 60 days. So the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission launched into the Water System Improvement Program that you're helping to pay for now, $4.8 billion worth of seismic improvements. Here's the new Irvington Tunnel, Calaveras Dam's being replaced. But they also looked at population growth and incorporated into the WSIP, as we call it, Water System Improvement Program, a proposal to divert an additional 25 million gallons per day from the Tuolumne. And we were very opposed to that. We worked with the Pacific Institute to do a study and report. We argued that the potential for conservation was underestimated, demand projections were exaggerated, they hadn't looked at climate change. We did a lot of media work around it, turned out a lot of people to hearings, and the PUC, to their credit, came to us and we reached a compromise that they would cap water sales at 265 million gallons per day until at least 2018, and it looks like it's going to go beyond that, and to focus on conservation. So conservation, we've all been working together since then, have a great relationship with PUC, with BAWSCA, with other water agencies. Recycled water is going to be a big part of our future. We use it right now for irrigation mainly, which requires a lot of purple pipe. But the Santa Clara Valley Water District just this year came online with an advanced purified water system. And this is producing 8 million gallons per day of essentially potable water, drinking water. We have to overcome the yuck factor though before we put it into the system. So right now it's being blended with recycled water for irrigation. Eventually it'll be indirect potable reuse, putting it down into the groundwater, which is what they're doing in Orange County, 72 million gallons per day. And eventually it'll just go right into the water system when we're ready for it. So we do a lot of outreach and communications. I mentioned Paddle to the Sea. We have education programs. That's the Tuolumne My Tap for 4th through 6th grade students. If you know any teachers in the area who'd want us to come in, we'd be happy to do that. And then I'm really happy to report that all of us working together, we have made a big difference. And since 2008 and the WSIP approval, we're down to 225 million gallons per day in most years, so much below the cap. And last year, we really responded to the drought, and we were under 210 million gallons per day. So that was great. BAWSCA did a great job with this study. The demand projections for 2040 for this area are 20% lower than they were originally. So in normal years, we're well under our budget. It's just these extended droughts that are a challenge. Climate change could reduce our water by 30%, perhaps more. This is the Mount Lyell Glacier, which is no longer a glacier because it doesn't have the mass to move. Probably be gone in 5 to 10 years. Not a huge hit on our water supply, but it's definitely a signal of things to come. Don Pedro Dam's going through relicensing. More water is going to be required to flow into the lower Tuolumne. San Francisco PUC is on the hook for a little bit more than half of that. So it's really paying off that we're conserving, because it could be in normal years that we have plenty of water for everything. And then finally, the State Water Board is working on these issues. They're trying to improve water quality in the Delta and Bay, and they're looking at freshwater flows from rivers like the Tuolumne. So you'll hear more about that in the summer when they come up with a plan. So I just like to close by reminding people that in San Mateo County, 75% of your water comes from the Tuolumne, 70% of your body is water, more than half of your body is Tuolumne River water. So, we have a stake in this. Thank you very much.